Lights out. It was late autumn. The mild weather had passed and the cold had its claws out, ready for winter. I worked a crappy job serving customers at the local convenience store. The hours were long and the pay was crummy. I hated it there. Most days I would sit at the counter and read comics with a sign on the door telling people, "Sorry, we're closed," in overly cursive text. That's what the last 24 years of my life had culminated to. It just seemed like life had a bouncer, and I didn't know the right people to get in. That night, however, was unusually quiet, so I kept the door open. To be honest, the silence had me a little creeped out. All I could hear was the buzzing of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional crackle as a mosquito was drawn into the bug zapper. I had just finished my comic and was about to grab the next edition off the shelf when the light above my head started to flicker. I watched as it flashed on and off wildly before blowing out, leaving me standing in a small patch of shadow. With a sigh, I climbed up on one of the shelves and jiggled the bulb a little. Without any warning, the light next to me began to flicker as well, then the next one, and the next. Before I could climb down, the whole store was flickering, as if I was caught in the world's quietest rave. By that point, I was thoroughly spooked and ready to get out of there, but as suddenly as it started, it came to a halt. I let out a shaky breath I didn't know I had been holding and turned my head back to the counter. Just as I sat down, every light in the store exploded all at once. I covered my face with my arms as shards of glass rained down over me. I was momentarily blinded by the sudden darkness, but my vision quickly returned thanks to the soft blue glow of the bug zapper, the only source of light remaining. By this point, my heart was racing and I was completely freaked out. As I scrambled towards the counter for my phone and turned on the built-in torch, I saw my reflection in the store window. I turned to get a better look and check for any cuts from the falling glass, but I looked unscathed. Although, something seemed odd about the face on my reflection. It almost seemed distorted. With that, I closed up early, leaving a note for the boss telling him I'd come in early the next day to clean up all the glass. There was no way I was staying there any longer, though. I'd hoped by the time I got home the shock would have passed, but I actually felt worse. My heart was still racing. I'd broken into a cold sweat in the corner of my eye. I could swear I saw a shape darting around, though when I turned to look, it moved with me, staying just out of sight. I put it down to nerves and hurried home. I lived in a cheap, run-down apartment building, the type where you find rats more often than residents. It was a death trap, but with my pay it was all I could afford. I decided to have a shower, hoping the heat would wash away the tension in my shoulders. I felt a little better, but I couldn't put my face under the stream. I didn't want to close my eyes. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I just laid there, staring out my window. My bedroom was tiny, only fitting a single bed against the wall, a small bedside table jammed in next to it, and a set of drawers which would fit more clothes on it than in it. There was also a window, which was too small to allow in more than a sliver of the outside world, which was usually covered by the leaves of a large apple tree barely clinging to life. But all the leaves had fallen, and the night sky was clear, save for the tree's bare branches which tapped against my window, like bony fingers calling for attention. I barely saw them as I looked out in the night. A clear sky, not a cloud to be seen, but there wasn't a moon either. I shivered and pulled my blankets a little tighter. I had left the kitchen light on, but I was too tired to get out and turn it off. I was still feeling a little uneasy, so I didn't mind too much. It was dim, only strong enough to outline the silhouettes of my belongings anyway. Eventually, I was asleep. I was woken up not long after by the sound of breaking glass. At first, I thought I was being robbed, but who would break into a place like this? I stayed very still, listening intently in the dark. But hadn't I left the kitchen light on? I slowly reached for my small LED torch I kept on my bedside table. My fingers curled around the cold metal, and with a small click I flooded the room with light. The shadows seemed to dart away, almost cowering in the corners of my room. I glanced around, careful to see if anything had changed, but the door to the kitchen hadn't moved. The bulb must have blown. Maybe a rat had chewed on the wrong wire, I said to myself. I swept the torch over my room one last time before switching it off and putting it back on the table. I closed my eyes and focused on slowing my heart. But just as I began to drift away again, I heard a faint creaking as if the door was slowly opening. My eyes shot open and I fumbled for the torch, but in my panic I knocked it over and heard it roll off the table and hit the floor with a heavy clunk. I laid there in the dark as the fear began to build. It gripped my throat and turned my chest to lead. I was paralyzed. Too afraid to blink. Too afraid to even breathe. The shadows in my imagination conspired to twist all my belongings, so familiar in the safety of daylight, into monstrous figures, writhing and reaching out for me. Maybe it would have been better if I couldn't see anything at all, I thought. I closed my eyes tight, blocking out all the light and with it the shadows, but it was no better that way. With my eyes closed, I was completely vulnerable. They could easily creep up on me. "Stop being so damn scared," I scolded myself. I lived in an old building which probably didn't meet safety regulations. Of course it would creak and moan on a cold night. This was no different to all the other things I used to be afraid of as a child. My brother, though 2 years younger than me, was always the braver one, climbing trees and getting into fights. I used to think he knew everything, so it never occurred to me that he would lie when he told me about the fish people that lived in the pipes under the bath, or the tooth fairy that would steal people's teeth straight from their mouths as they slept, or even the mutant rats hiding in the walls. None of them were real, and neither was any of the monsters in the dark. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. There was no way I was going back to sleep now. Though with my torch out of reach, I didn't have the courage to leave my bed and turn on my light. It couldn't have been very long before I noticed a soft scraping sound, like somebody dragging their feet as they walked. It was definitely coming this way. I couldn't see anything, only heard the soft footsteps closing in on me. The gentle creaking returned, and this time my bedroom door was being opened. I watched in abject horror as a figure stepped into the room. I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was completely impossible. It was me. Or at least a shadowy copy of me. I stood there with a manic grin that stretched just a little too wide and eyes just a little bit too large, just like my reflection in the window at work. It had been stalking me. It stood there and we stared at each other for what seemed an eternity. I couldn't cry out. I couldn't move. I was completely helpless under my copy's gaze. Then it reached forward, and its hands didn't look solid, forming and reforming. Through sheer force of will and a fear for my life, I finally moved, pushing myself off the bed and falling in a heap onto the floor. The bed was between us now, and I'd lost sight of the creature. All I could think of was the way its hand was moving, like oil on water, and then I realized it was only a shadow. That's why it had blown out the kitchen light. That's why all the lights had exploded at work. It couldn't cross through light. My mind was racing. The window didn't let in enough light to help me, but I knew of one thing that would. I looked under my bed, and there, barely silhouetted against the floor, was my torch. The shadow was at the end of the bed now, its soft footsteps closing in. I reached out for the torch, but I couldn't quite reach it. I'd have to push myself under, leaving me completely vulnerable. It was nearly on me, reaching out slowly, almost casually. I steeled myself, took a deep breath, and dove under the bed, scrabbling around until I had the torch in my hand. The instant I closed my hand around it, the creature's hand closed around my ankles and dragged me out from under the bed. I looked up at it in horror. Up close, I could see the way its face rippled and shifted, making it look like there was a swarm of insects crawling just beneath the surface. I didn't know what it was going to do to me, but it didn't matter. I knew what I was going to do to it. Grasping the torch firmly, I pointed it in the monster's face. It had just enough time to realize what I was doing, but before it could react, I pressed the button and filled the room with light. For an instant, the light passed through it, and my heart nearly stopped. It hadn't worked. Then the monster screamed. It leapt off me, but there were no shadows to run to anymore. It thrashed around, screaming as it quickly dissipated. The edges of its form seemed to evaporate like fog in the sun. Within an instant, it was gone, like it had never been. I sat there as I slowly began to sink in. I doubt I'll ever understand what happened to me that night. But I do know. I won.